Hey again, everyone. Welcome into another edition of Oklahoma Sooners Live. You know the deal. Leave those comments and questions in the live chat. We will get to them. It's our 60th edition here. We come your way every Wednesday. And again, though, schedules have to be determined each and every week. So please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we go live and you get the notification and you're all set. So here we are on another Wednesday for a 60th edition. We got Jason Ray on the line, of course, from Last Word on College Football. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing wonderful, Mark. How about yourself?
I'm good. I'm good. I enjoy the summertime, and the temperatures are right in line with that. Um, and so that's a good thing in my life. I like to be warm and not cold, especially the older I get. So
Good. Yeah. It's kind of fluctuating back and forth here in Oklahoma between weather. The weather. It's been very spring-like. We had a little dose of early summer here a few weeks ago, but now it's been kind of more in the 70s and things like that over the last couple of weeks. So a little bit of rain here today, but other than that, it's pretty comfortable spring weather. I'm sure it won't take any time at all before the dog days of summer here in Oklahoma to begin.
well, it's now June 1st, and that really kind of awakens us to football being right around the corner, despite summer not even really starting yet, because it'll only be about 6 to 7 weeks in that range before we see conference media days. And then right after that, everybody heads to camp to start August practice. So recruiting is huge this time of year, always is big, but this is a time to look at a lot of the candidates, a lot of the prospects firsthand at a lot of camps. And OU has a big weekend slated coming up.
Yeah, so Oklahoma has their annual what previously had under the previous coaching administration they had coined as the Champion Barbecue weekend. So they're continuing with that. Venables kind of came out and talked about really this being a very very good time with the open period and recruiting to kind of get to work and do a lot of things. So really busy next few days and overall weekend. Venables has some camps that are happening. I think they started today. I think they'll go on through the rest of the week here on. And then obviously the Champion Barbecue. So I think I think the list will fluctuate a little bit, Mark, just between now and when that happens, official visits come. But I've heard anywhere between 30 and 40 kids will either be here either on their unofficial visit or their official visit here with Oklahoma here in the spring or early summer, I guess I should say. And so, yeah, I mean, it's always a big weekend. Probably I would say, Mark, probably their second biggest recruiting weekend of the year outside of obviously the spring game was pretty big in terms of number of kids on campus. But then certainly this is one of their biggest single weekend events. Obviously, throughout the year they'll have some bigger games where they'll have a decent amount of recruits in. But yeah, I think this will be good because Oklahoma hasn't had the best of news in their recruiting cycle over the last week or so, just related to Oklahoma. Ashton Cozart had decommitted from Oklahoma and has flipped his commitment to Oregon. Was something that was a little bit expected, I think, over the last few weeks, Mark. But still, I think still a hit to that recruiting class. And so I think a lot of people that look and follow recruiting very very closely will probably look at Oklahoma's ranking right now, and maybe some eyeballs will pop out and some jaws will drop. Just relate. I think Oklahoma's number 34, number 35 overall. But I think a little bit of the change in philosophy from Brent Venables from the previous regime will kind of show early on. Meaning, Venables has really pushed these recruits to not commit to Oklahoma until they are 100% sure this is where they want to be, because I don't think that the staff wants to, number one, doesn't want to deal with a lot of decommitments and going back and kind of re-recruiting those kids, but also wants the kids to feel firm, and this is where they feel like that they're led to be. This is where they want to be, where their parents want them to be, and things like that. So like I said, not incredibly surprising to see Oklahoma where they're at, but I would anticipate that getting cranked up a little bit more here through the summer. Obviously, I think a lot of these kids want to have this process kind of finalized and done with by the time school starts in August, and obviously football season starts closely thereafter. But also I think Oklahoma will, as I mentioned previously, Venables has kind of came out and said that they want to um, do a lot of their work here in the June timeframe, and obviously early July before the dead period starts again. So will be interesting to see how many if Oklahoma gets any commitments out of this weekend. I think there's a couple that seem to be could possibly make the decision over the weekend, but nothing specific. But having that amount of kids on campus is good for the overall experience.
Number of the regulars in the chat. Good to see you, Aaron and Jay Jones, 288028, and others. We appreciate you being here. Invite your friends to join us each and every week on OU Live. Of course, Oklahoma fans first and foremost, but all college football fans are welcome. So Jason J is saying here, did I miss something here? I'm not, I don't know if this is an inside comment or you could possibly speak to this. He's saying, do you think the luxury cars is not a good message that it might be sending at the barbecue?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure, Jay, on the specifics around that. I think he made another. So I think this is more in relation to he was talking about the Hang Time podcast, which Michael Turk has his own little podcast. Who's the punter for Oklahoma, and he recently got an NIL deal, and he has been in some of his podcasts, he talks about, and he's driving around in his luxury car. So I think that's probably the context here
Okay.
as well. But I think to that point, Mark, that Jay's mentioning here, when you look at oh, and he's commenting here about a car show. I remember that last year there was a little bit of a car show on the field during the recruiting barbecue weekend. So um, thanks for the reminder, Jay. So, but I think when you think about how much NIL is a discussion, right? When you look at that, whether or not that is just something that people are bringing in just to impress the recruits, or whether it's something that Michael Turk as a punter is getting an NIL deal, related to from a car dealership. I think that's also obviously going to be a big proponent of how these big weekends are happening throughout the country, right? You have to at least expect each one of these teams that have big recruiting weekends to talk in depth about NIL and what this specific school is doing, what the opportunities are there available for you. But I think it will be interesting how Venables attacks this, because and I think there's some comments here but Venables is a little bit more, I would say, kind of conservative, laid back, as opposed to how Riley was before. So that'll be interesting to see what this looks like throughout this weekend.
Yeah, no numbers are official. It's obviously a private matter between individuals, those players, and the businesses. The IRS and the school keeps track of it. I'm sure, though, at some point somebody's going to put together. I know that I've seen lists. I don't know how valid they are. I don't think that they are very valid, but I've seen lists of people that have put together some type of numbers estimating what schools have what level of collectives and how much money, but I don't know that that's valid at this point, or ever will be, because of the nature of it not being public. So that's where we stand with that.
Right.
Everybody, get familiar with your new conference. So it's kind of a big deal each and every spring/summer, right around Memorial Day weekend, that the SEC gets together, all the coaches, and kind of work on, discuss, implement at times changes to the league, deal with large scale issues, topics facing college football. And leading into it, Jason, we know that Greg Sankey was very transparent about talking about. I saw the statement where he said 40 different models of SEC only playoffs, coupled with division formats, pods, uh, all the things that are being discussed regarding scheduling and the formation of teams within the structure of the conference, and then how that relates to a playoff. And that's one of the big topics on hand. Besides the sideshow of Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher and where they're sitting and if they're going to talk to each other, but in terms of the important stuff for college football fans, OU and Texas, of course, supposedly joining in 2025. Again, I can't imagine, but the SEC has this annual get together and they discuss such things, and this is what they're looking at right now, of course.
Yeah, you're right, Mark. And I think there was a lot of interesting comments that I've seen, and so first from the playoff perspective, Sankey was flexing his SEC muscles a bit in some of that commentary. I had saw some quotes around specifically around talking about the playoff situation, and and he had said, we had a pretty good, SEC only championship game and playoff situation last year, and so I think the rest of the country, by and large, is I think, very adamant, certainly about expanding the playoffs, and I think Sankey is one of those where he's fine. I think he's fine with whatever everybody wants to do, right? He's comfortable with the way it is right now because, obviously because of the strength of the SEC, the SEC's got is always going to have at least one team in, possibly even two, in a four team playoff. So, what's the thought if it's expanded to 8 or 12? I mean, does the SEC get four, even five or six, in that situation? So I think that's interesting as we go through this process of really kind of understanding the time frame as to when the playoffs would get expanded, understanding those comments, and then I think that to your point, Mark, about the scheduling and things like that, that's the thing probably more, I think, probably near term, more near and dear to folks on here from Oklahoma and even from a Texas perspective. I think the one thing that is interesting that I've seen commentary related to sources within the SEC athletic directors is that there's not a ton of momentum towards a pod system, and as far as hearing that there definitely will be no pod system, which is, I think, a little surprising because I think that was the growing sentiment that a lot of us believed in terms of where the SEC would go as far as that. But it looks like, and of course, this is nothing confirmed, but it looks like there's more momentum towards a 9 game conference season with 3 permanent rivals that you would play every year, and then the six. And the 6 other games would be in a kind of a rotation type of situation. So, which has brought forward in a lot more, intrigue in terms of what that, not really a pod, but what those permanent rivals would be for Oklahoma. Certainly Texas would be one. Certainly you think probably, and it would be some combination of Arkansas, Missouri, or Texas A&M being the other two. I think Texas A&M has made it abundantly clear that they either don't want to be in the same pod as Texas, or they don't want to play Texas every single year. So as odd as it sounds, I don't know that Texas and Texas A&M would be in the same pod, but I would expect that that it's certainly between those four, mark for the three, um, permanent teams that they would play. I would probably guess that it would be that you would see Texas, Missouri, and probably Texas A&M for Oklahoma right now. Like I said, there's a chance that Arkansas, could be there, but Texas is really kind of developing more of a rivalry, so to speak, or they've played more often with Arkansas. So you got to think if Oklahoma, I mean, if Texas and Texas A&M wants no part of playing Texas every single year, then it would kind of lend that to believe that Arkansas probably was more of their permanent. But so I think not only that, but that provides a little bit of an intrigue in terms of moving from an 8 game um, schedule, SEC schedule, to a 9 game schedule, or whatever it ends up being. How do you schedule your non-conference games is another thing that's very interesting. I think we've talked about this. I know that you've been talk when you talk about Alabama, for example. Typically, that they don't go on the road to play non-conference games. They play a lot of their non-conference games in neutral site. Classic games the first or the second week. This is the first year in quite some time that they've went on the road, for one, and number two, they have not. They're not playing in one of those classic games early on. So will be interesting to see what that looks like. When you have, from Oklahoma's perspective, I think when you have a loaded 9 game SEC schedule, it makes it hard to think through scheduling a any kind of a tough non-conference schedule, right? I mean, I think there's still discussions whether Oklahoma and Oklahoma State are going to play each other every year, and so I think those are interesting conversations to understand, what what the mindset of some of those teams will be. I know that there's a lot of teams in the SEC that historically will schedule an FCS opponent in the non-conference. Typically those are kind of in the November timeframe almost every year. But so those are things that will be interesting looking at. To your point, whether or not it's 2025 or probably more near term, maybe 23 or 24.
It's been 11 years since Alabama's traveled
Hmm.
anywhere that was not a neutral site game. 11 years. They went to Penn State in 2011. Yeah, Oklahoma's in a difficult position along with a lot of other teams. So I just have to think that once you go to a 16-team league, not to go to a 9 game conference schedule, if you're going to stay with 8, you are not playing 7 teams in the conference every year. And let's say you do have 3 designated opponents. I guess you can still get to a point where you play everybody at least every other season. I've seen some models that were, I think, 3, 6, and 6, but that's too many games. Well, that's a 9 game season, so you're playing 3 uh, designated rivals, then you're playing 6 of the remaining 12 teams in the conference every other year, then playing the other 6 on the off years. Or I have seen a 1-7-7 model where you only have 1 designated rival and you're rotating the other 14 teams in a split of 7 and 7 the other 2 seasons. But like you say, a lot of teams in the SEC Eastern Division, Georgia, Kentucky, Florida, Clemson, have rivalry games that they play against ACC teams at the end of the season. So they already have a Power 5 opponent who may, in South Carolina's case here in recent years, taking on Clemson is a formidable game. So I don't know if somebody like Oklahoma would want to get locked into a game every year with Oklahoma State. And then you get into a situation where if you are locked into that game, then you don't have any variety to the schedule. You're not going out playing anybody else in the Power 5, or you're creating an extremely difficult schedule, a brutal schedule if you've got Oklahoma State and you're going to go out and grab another Power 5 opponent, especially if you only have 3 non-conference games. So I would think something would be put together where Oklahoma State would play half the time or a third of the time, maybe a 2-game home and home, and then take 3 years off and then come back with another 2-game home and home or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think it would be, and that's what we've seen with conference realignment, right? Is that there's a lot of these rivalries that some are just no longer being played. Texas and Texas A&M, Oklahoma, Nebraska, just to name a couple, that are not being played. But I think, and also to your point, Mark, about when you think Clemson, South Carolina, is that something that's gonna continue to happen? I think with with the uncertainty of an expanded playoff, it's you have to think from an I mean, and almost anyone, but specifically if you're a team that has national championship aspirations, do you want to challenge yourself to that degree in the non-conference, with the understanding that you're going to have a very challenging conference season, and you want to put yourself in the best position to have an opportunity to play, to get into that playoff, whether it's a 4-team or what it ends up being down the road. I think it's going to be interesting, Mark, to see when these things converge, when all of these things kind of converge at once. The college football playoff thing is 2025, I believe, is when that contract ends, or maybe it's the end of the 2024 season or end of 2025. I don't remember.
I think it's at the end of 25.
So it almost, when you think about this from Oklahoma and Texas's perspective, it almost even makes sense to wait until 2025 to go, when you think of what that schedule would look like, on top of what their already determined non-conference schedule would be with the expanded playoffs and things like that. So yeah, it's going to be so interesting to see, not only when it happens for Oklahoma and Texas, but some other teams across the country. And then you obviously think of the new Big 12 will be a reality next year. Will they have any? Will both sides have any interest in being part of that? So it's a lot of intrigue. We've talked about this a ton. I think I would still, if Oklahoma and Texas are going in 2023, I would probably expect to hear something this summer, if not early fall. But I guess we'll see.
Jason, 2 directions I'd like to go is, I think it's funny, this Texas A&M dynamic. So some type of vote, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I distinctly remember when the Texas-Oklahoma expansion came out, and it was still just rumored, but as soon as it hit the scene, it was pretty much substantiated that this is a real thing and this is happening. So it wasn't one of these slow grinding for weeks and weeks and weeks, what's going on with this. It was pretty substantiated once it hit the scene and people found out what was going on. But we quickly found out that there was some type of vote that leaked, and Texas A&M, I think, was the only, maybe there was one other school that was voting against it, for obvious reasons. Texas A&M trying to keep Texas out of the league, and it was like a 13-1 vote or something. But Texas A&M was the guy, because this changes their dynamic considerably. They left the Big 12, and even though the results on the field haven't been dominant, they've become a different program. They've been looked upon differently now in the last 10 years in terms of going to get a big name head coach and paying him as much as anybody, and facilities and everything involved in recruiting, that they're just this major player now. They're not 7-5, 8-4 Texas A&M that's squeaking into the top 25 back in the Big 12 days most of the time. They're this major player in college football, and they had that upper hand to go into recruits houses and flash the SEC. And now certainly they didn't want Texas coming in. And then you made the statement that they've made it known that, and I don't know if this is coming from both directions, both schools not wanting to play each season, but when we look at division matchups in any conference and how the conference is aligned, I got to think that the great majority of each fan base wants to play every year. And basically, your average college football fan would assume Texas A&M or Texas joining the SEC would be playing Texas A&M every year, that they would be attached together because that was one of the great rivalries in college football. And we'll see if the SEC just powers that through and says you're going to have to play nice and you're going to play each year, or they go another direction with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. To your point, Mark, the narrative has changed around Texas A&M, and I think they wanted to. Obviously, they wanted to get away from Texas to a certain degree to kind of make their own name in the SEC. And I think there was a comment in here that was really what was really solid is Texas, the University of Texas, is probably the only team that can challenge Texas A&M in terms of kind of the money thing and what they're able to accomplish in the state of Texas. And the benefit that A&M has had over these last few years is obviously the SEC logo on their chest, and now everything is even from that perspective. But I think the area that you've got to be, I think that you've got to be optimistic, Mark, if you're Texas A&M, is that you've had much more success over the last few years in a much tougher conference than Texas has had over the last few years in what many consider to be a much weaker conference in the Big 12. So I think they've certainly got a leg up on Texas coming into the conference. I mean, we all know that Texas has more money than the University of Texas has more money than any school in the country, and they have more resources, and so it maybe levels the playing field to a certain degree, but at the same time, you still got to coach them. You still got to perform on the field, and the fact of the matter is Texas consistently since Mac Brown has left has not been in a position where they've or they have consistently won at a high level. I don't think they've even had a single year that they've won, certainly not at the level that Mac Brown did at one point. I mean, I think their best year was a few years ago when they made the Big 12 championship game 9-3. I think was their then they won the Sugar Bowl, I believe, that year when they beat Georgia. But yeah, then it kind of went downhill again from there. So yeah, just the consistency that Texas hasn't been able to produce over the last 8-10 years gives Texas A&M that decided advantage. And so I mean, I think Sankey's going to make all of them play nice in the sandbox. At least play in the same sandbox. Maybe not necessarily play nice. I think a little bit of that has gone out the window with this whole Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher charade here over the last week and a half. But yeah, I mean, I think that dynamic is going to be so interesting. So whether or not they play every year or whether or not they play every other year, I mean, I think at the end of the day is inconsequential, right? I mean, they're still going to play. They're still going to play each other fairly regularly, and and that's just A&M's going to have to deal with it. And I think but they're in a much better position to deal with that and compete than they ever were in the Big 12.
Although I guess Sankey's done about as good as damage control as you can do. He pulled Lane Kiffin off the Dan Patrick show. Now, if there's one guy that you would not want as an SEC ambassador to be, on a national show the day after all that happens. It's Lane Kiffin making his smug remarks and sarcastic remarks about it. So Sankey jumped right on that. And then I wouldn't be surprised if he pulled Saban and Fisher off to the side, whether that was together or individually, and said, no fireworks during our coaches' meetings. This is done. Let's all say what we need to say and make the right statements about the league. This is, I know that, like, for example, on Twitter and also on the YouTube community page, I took polls that got about 1,000 votes, something like that, about whether this was good for college football because it keeps it in the news cycle and gains a lot of attention, or is it bad for college football because it's embarrassing. I was not surprised, based on this social media generation, that it was viewed as a positive by like 70 some percent as a positive. To me, this is complete. Yes, did it? These kind of things usually don't grab my attention. I think they're stupid. I run from them. It just doesn't interest me. But I got to admit, the theatrics of it, I found entertaining to a certain degree. But in the real world, acting like an adult, looking at it, it's embarrassing. You shouldn't have two of your coaches accusing each other, or what could be interpreted as accusing one of them at cheating, and then the other one coming back with, phrases like czar-like and god-like, and everyone treats him like, you just cannot have that in a conference. So it's a black mark against the SEC. It's not the end of the world. I don't want to call it out to be anything such as that. People will forget it, and the results on the field will continue to carry the SEC. So it's not doom and gloom by any stretch. It's embarrassing to have any of your coaches, let alone most likely the two most prominent ones, acting like that. So,
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say it's.
Sure.
It's just kind of funny. I mean, I think it's. I mean, to your point, I completely agree. It was entertaining, right? But I think it was very childish on both. Specifically, I mean, I don't know. Let's say specifically, but from Jimbo Fisher's perspective, he called a special news conference just to respond to what was said. And I think the funniest thing about this, Mark, is I don't think that really, I mean, some of the adjectives that Jimbo Fisher used was not obviously something that I would use, but by and large, most of these things that each coach said, they're not untrue. I mean, they're pretty. I mean, they're fairly factual in nature. I mean, Jimbo Fisher can go up there and say, as much as he wants to, that A&M, did not buy players, and by the letter of the law, they probably didn't buy players, right? But their NIL deals were so lucrative in nature that they got so many of these kids in this recruiting cycle, and I think there's an element of truth to what Jimbo Fisher mentioned, to Saban. If he's not the best at something, it really bothers him, and whether it's recruiting or whether it's winning a championship or whatever it is, it's something that obviously irks at him in such a way. And I think, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing as a competitor. But I think, yeah, at the same time, it was all silly. It was all silly. And the fact that it was and they even got Deion Sanders in the whole mix on the Travis Hunter kid. And his was maybe the funniest of all. And this is, I don't even make that amount of money. How am I gonna pay a player more money than I even make through a year? And that's just, to see how that thing happened. I mean, obviously we'll never know, right? Us will never know, but how that whole thing transpired in Jackson State, actually getting the number one player in the country, is, again, speaks to the beauty of this sport. Is, there's always something that comes out that you never saw happening. So it'll certainly, if nothing else, it will make the Texas A&M Alabama game probably the most intriguing, at least nationally, maybe the most intriguing game of the season coming in. Obviously, depending on how both teams are playing up until that point.
Folks, hit the like button. We appreciate that. It helps the YouTube algorithm. So I can't explain it, but basically it comes down to this. If there's a large percentage of likes for any video or live stream, then YouTube will send that video out into traffic. So, when you get on YouTube, it says suggested videos. Well, this gets pushed out into more suggested videos if there's a large percentage of likes. So if there's a lot of views and a lot of likes, then it will get suggested. So we want that. We would like to stay on and doing this for a long, long time. So you can help us do that by watching the videos. Of course, you're here, but also hitting the like button and getting other people involved here in the live chat, whether that's live or if they can't make it live. Of course, send the videos out on social media, send the links out and get people involved. Oklahoma fans, of course, first and foremost, but all college football fans, welcome. So the other part that I wanted to hit on that you jumped in on was, of course, Big 12 scheduling with the 4 newcomers on board in 2023. I haven't sat down to figure out whether this is feasible, but we talked about this a few weeks ago, whether the league would separate Oklahoma and Texas, have them only play current members of the league, keep them away from the 4 incoming members, and then have those 4 only play everybody else. I don't know if I guess that's possible.
Yeah, I would think it would be. I would think it would be possible. I mean, probably not ideal, obviously, but I think that would be possible. I don't know, Mark. I mean, you have to think that. So as you think about this, when they put these schedules together, right? So they'll probably start putting these schedules together for next conference season. What spring, early spring next year, maybe even late winter.
Yeah.
So I think again, this kind of lends to the idea that you feel like you would need to have a good, solid understanding of what Oklahoma and Texas are doing by late summer this year to see if okay, are they going to be part of this new temporary 16 team Big 12 league, or are they going to be part of the new 16 team SEC league? Starting in 2023. But and then to your point, if Oklahoma and Texas are still part of the Big 12 in this temporary 16 team league, does Oklahoma and Texas just play the other members that they traditionally played? Is there some sort of mix with playing some of these new members? How do you determine if you don't play those teams? How do you determine who goes to the Big 12 championship game? Do they split these up into to conferences or to divisions? Which I think most teams are starting to go away from divisions, at least in terms of qualifications for the league championship, because I think the NCAA, I think it was this year, I mean earlier this summer or earlier this spring, that they had made the determination that you don't actually have to have there's not a requirement to have a winner from each division to have a championship game. So the top 2 teams, I think, in some of these conferences they've already made the change that will be part of that conference championship. So I think those are a lot of questions that will have to be answered. So I think to a certain degree, Oklahoma and Texas are holding a couple of conferences here ransom in terms of what happens. And I know the SEC is very, very much in those conversations. Is probably at the end of the day they're making some of the decisions as well, along with ESPN. But like I said, that's why you don't think this will go much more than the end of summer, because there's some obviously decisions that have to be made sooner than later on what both of those conferences and their schedules and affiliations would look like.
I'm intrigued by what the results on the field will give fodder to in regards to conferences looking better or looking worse based on these changes. So if these four come into the league and they perform well while Oklahoma and Texas are still around, and that it would be, there's just a lot of scenarios here that I would love to see play out. See these four come into the league, and if they get to play Texas and Oklahoma, what if those four? Let's play this out for the 3 years that OU and Texas are supposed to be in the league, and let's say they play a collection of 12 games against those four teams in the span of, let's say they go 4-8. That's not going to happen, but I'm taking this to an extreme. If those four teams play well against Texas and Oklahoma before sending them off to the SEC, that gives the Big 12 a lot of future credibility. If the league's able to shut out Oklahoma and Texas, or not give them too many or allow them too many spots in the conference championship game in the next 3 years, that looks good for the league going forward, that this wasn't our league and it's leaving. On the flip side of Oklahoma and Texas, if Texas gets its act together and this is the championship game the last year or two that these teams are in the league, that's obviously not a good look for the Big 12 when the two championship participants move on. Likewise, just to put the SEC in its place to a certain extent, I would love Oklahoma and Texas to go into the SEC and play really well. So
yeah, it's so intriguing on so many levels, Mark, and and even more so, what's the as you move forward into 2025 and things like that, what does the uh, what's the national perception of this new Big 12 league? Right? Is it still one of those? I think there's certain belief that from a playoff perspective, there'll be some sort of automatic qualifier scenario come into play. Whether there's some stipulations around rankings and stuff like that around it, but still believe that there's going to be some sort of um, some sort of automatic qualifier. Is the Big 12, is the thought that this new Big 12 still has enough clout, has enough to get that automatic qualifier? And when you think about that, they don't have I mean, they're still considered a Power Five conference, obviously, but if that's not the case, do they cease from being a Power Five conference, anymore? So, I think that's going to be something else that's interesting when you think of, not a blue blood, um, per se, but a program that's been really solid over the last 10 years, Oklahoma State, right? Are they on kind of on the outside looking in? I mean, you could BYU kind of on the same side, not necessarily a blue blood, but one of a very known commodity in the college football world. So, yeah, so that'll be interesting as well. Not to mention the things that you mentioned also.
because you got to be careful of what you ask for. Uh, Maryland and Rutgers were nothing close to being football powers, but Maryland was a pretty successful mid-tier ACC team, and Rutgers was one of the best teams, a contending team in the Big East, and both of them are just getting kicked around in the Big Ten. Their overall records may not look too bad once they win some games out of conference, but their Big Ten records are horrible. They are getting slaughtered for the most part. Nebraska, of course, made the last two Big 12 championship games, and they went into the Big Ten as a division winner their first year and gave up 70 points, and they haven't been heard from really since. They've gotten kicked around by the upper half of the Big Ten, and it's not been a successful transition, at least on the field for Nebraska. I don't know what the money standpoint looks like, except knowing that the Big Ten is right there with the SEC prior to this expansion in terms of money. So Nebraska's got to be making more money than the Big 12 teams are in revenue, but it's not been a great look for the football program for 10 or 12 years.
Yeah, no, you're. I mean, and that's. I think that's. I mean, it's always a concern. I mean, I think a lot of Oklahoma people will think that they won't be subjected to that. I think the thing that Oklahoma has for its benefit, I think, is the change in administration from Lincoln Riley to Venables. I think is a good is a really good situation. They're doing a lot of things that are preparing them for the move to the SEC. Not only from a football perspective, they've had a Board of Regents meeting this past month where they talked about and requested tons of improvements through all of the. Obviously, football is part of it, but there's tons of improvements through all the sports programs at the University of Oklahoma just to get them ready for the SEC. So you've got examples, Mark, of some of these teams that have left the Big 12 and have been successful over the years, and then you've got another fair amount of these teams that have left the Big 12 and have not been real successful. When you look at Colorado, they've not really contended, to the degree that maybe and they even did it in the Big 12 or the Big 8 prior to that. Then you look at Nebraska, kind of the same situation. Texas A&M, as we talked about a little bit earlier, has been better than they were perennially with the Big 12, but you've got a lot of examples on both sides where to see what Oklahoma and Texas will be. I think, as we've mentioned, Texas is in a little bit more of a vulnerable spot just in terms of their success on the field than Oklahoma has over the last, specifically over the last decade. It's something, there's going to be some teams that move around, and not just the Big 12, but as conference realignment, kind of continues to morph and get going, where some of these teams will end up being in better positions or will compete better than they were in their existing conference, but you'll still have these, to your point, your Marylands and Rutgers and Nebraskas and Colorados that don't compete as well as they did previously.
Talking OU football with all of you each and every Wednesday here on the Voice of College Football. Please subscribe because when we need to make scheduling changes, you will be notified immediately when we schedule those shows. So again, please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications. A couple of weeks ago, Jason ran through the 2021 recruiting class and just kind of sized up that freshman season on where everybody stood and who maybe got off to a good start in their Oklahoma career, and we'll continue that over the summer months as well. Don't necessarily have enough time for it today, but we'll go through 2020 and head on back. And obviously, as we go back in time, it's going to become more intriguing as to who boomed and who busted in these OU classes and where they wound up. There was I was alerted to a tweet that was originally sent out by Josh Pate from 247 Sports. And then I did not see the original tweet, until somebody tweeted me and said, Mark, go over to that thread and straighten these people out. So anyway, I go over there, and Josh Pate had sent out, and this is a pretty standard debate starter, but I enjoy these kind of debates. He was asking to rank the top 5 programs. It was either the last 20 years. It's so close. I don't know if he was asking the last 20 years or he was asking 21st century, which takes you to 2000, or it was the last 20 years, which would be 02 through 21. And so do you have any thoughts about, it was very easy for me to come up with my top 5 very clearly. And then after that, I would just have to numbers crunch. I'd have to go through winning percentages and conference championships and the like to really differentiate the rest. But you have a thought about Oklahoma?
Yeah, I saw the and I don't recollect what the official top 5 was, but I saw the tweet that you had mentioned, and I saw a little bit of this when he put this out on his podcast that he does, and I think he had Oklahoma number 5 if I remember correctly. And yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Mark, there's you can easily define, these top four, top five, just from a consistency perspective. You probably have some combination of Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma, probably maybe Georgia, Clemson. Maybe you could make an argument for an LSU or a couple of other teams you could make an argument for. But I think when you look at Oklahoma, it's always a very interesting discussion when you look at over the last 20 years. I mean, they're probably one of the only teams on that list, Mark, that hasn't won a national championship. So I think it's interesting. It all goes back to what's your criteria. A lot of people think, especially at that level, if you haven't won a championship, then you're not part of that top five, or you're not part of that top 10, whatever the number is that you have defined it to. But I think at the end of the day, the success that Oklahoma has had from a conference, from a conference championship perspective, is solid in terms of what that argument is and the number of wins that Oklahoma has. I think Oklahoma's probably fair to put them at number 5 where they're at without winning that championship, or even winning the college football playoff game.
Yeah, just about everyone I saw responding put Bama number 1, and I completely understand that. I do push back to a certain extent because, again, we're looking at 20 years. Certainly in the last 10, they've got it hands down. They're number 1. It's not even close. But if you go back 20, for the first 7 years, they didn't do anything. They had a couple decent seasons, but they had some awful seasons. So for the first 7 of 20, there's really nothing there. Where Ohio State put together the most consistently dominant 20 years, like basically living in the top 5 for 20 years. So that's, again, Bama's got the national championships. Ohio State has a much better winning percentage over the 20 years. Oklahoma's got the most, they may have the most conference championships, even over Ohio State. I believe they do. Yeah, you can tackle it from a number of ways, but I was pretty clear on, Alabama, Ohio State. Again, I have an issue with the 1-2 position, but yeah, Clemson's an interesting one too, because they've had a dominant 10 years, but before that, they were a good program, but nowhere near this conversation up until 2012 or 13. And so, yeah, I was pretty comfortable with some combination of Alabama, Ohio State 1-2, and then LSU. I was giving Georgia a nod with 2 championship game appearances recently, although it shouldn't be recent. Every year should count the same, but they did win the 1 national title. But Oklahoma's been, again, more consistent than Georgia, certainly over 20 years. So yep. It's interesting. All right, sir. Unless you got a parting shot, I think we're all set.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
All right. Once again, everyone, appreciate you being here. Please subscribe and hit the like button. And the reason you subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications to know when we go live. Oklahoma Sooners live, 60 consecutive weeks. Jason, we appreciate you being here as always.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mark.